My father when I was a kid was so deeply involved with Native Americans, he used to bring home these extraordinary headdresses and pipes. The home ownership process for Native Americans has been hobbled by bureaucratic delays and regulations. Native Americans have faced centuries of atrocities to their people, their land, and their culture, all under various presidents who took an oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I've always been interested in the history of the West, our country, and particularly as it relates to the Native Americans, the original Americans. I love Caribbean food. It's a great melting pot of so many cultures including the Native Americans. Arizona faces unique healthcare challenges including uncompensated care for illegal immigrants, and the large number of Native Americans who live in remote and isolated areas of the state. The public, the whites, not just in Oklahoma, but across the United States, were transfixed by the Osage wealth which belied images of Native Americans that could be traced back to the first brutal contact with whites. For far too long, the voices of Native Americans have been woefully underrepresented in Congress. Like Native Americans and African Americans, women and LGBTQ people, Puerto Ricans should be seen as part of the same overarching struggle for equality, in a nation whose greatest vice is the perennial failure to practice the virtue it preaches. I believe Native Americans, women, and all of us deserve representation, and that we all need to fight with everything we have to make it so. Native Americans' families experience living in increasingly small reservations surrounded by the society that destroyed their civilization, and are still stigmatized. For decades and decades, for hundreds of years except in Indian schools, they weren't allowed to speak their language. That stigma takes a terrible toll. Especially for blacks, but also for many Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. Group identity is now shaped more by a liberal politics in which past victimization is deferred to, and for which redress is sought with preferential treatment, than by a unified culture. American football seems to resemble soccer in that one scores by putting the ball through the opponent's goal, but football, truly is about land. The settlers want to move the line of scrimmage westward, the Native Americans want to move it east. From the age of about 8 to the age of about 15, I was obsessed with Native Americans. America is, and will always be, a success story. We have African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, and members of other ethnic groups elected to positions inside our governments. Through the years, I found we had Native American blood in us. My great-grandmother came from the island of Martinique, and they hooked up with the Native Americans of Louisiana. Many years ago, I spent $5,000 at a fundraiser to hang with another lame duck, Bill Clinton. I lobbied him to pardon Leonard Peltier, the Nelson Mandela of Native Americans. But my father also supported human rights, freedom and self-determination for all people, including Latino agricultural workers, Native Americans, and the millions of impoverished white men and women who were treated as second-class citizens. I always understood my ancestry, like that of so many others in the Gulf Coast, to be a tangle of African slaves, free men of color, French and Spanish immigrants, British colonists, Native Americans, but in what proportion, and what might that proportion tell me about who I thought I was? At issue when professional sports teams take the name of Native Americans is the problem of mimicry, having appropriated the land and wealth of America's vanquished peoples. Settler culture then appropriates the supposed values and spirit of the vanquished as well. When you start to look at Native American history, you realize that, very far from being a peaceful, morally superior people, Native Americans were not that different from Europeans. I started collecting aerial photographs of Native American and South Pacific architecture, only the African ones were fractal. And if you think about it, all these different societies have different geometric design themes that they use. So Native Americans use a combination of circular symmetry and fourfold symmetry. In my own view, the life expectancy of Native Americans in the United States is one of the really great moral crises that we face. I remember hearing stories from my mother and father about their parents and grandparents when they were taken off the reservation, taken to the boarding schools, and pretty much taught to be ashamed of who they were as Native Americans. You can feel that impact today. I spent my 20s earning minimum wage decorating cakes for a living. But one day, I looked in the mirror and realized I wanted more, for me and my people. I saw too many Native Americans struggling, and I realized we should have a voice in who our elected officials are. The one thing about Lumbee people is that there's so many stereotypes about Native Americans, especially reservation Native Americans, and we all tend to get lumped under that umbrella. But the Lumbee are non-reservation. I grew up no different than anybody would in normal American communities. Native Americans had only stone and wooden weapons and no animals that could be ridden. Those military advantages repeatedly enabled troops of a few dozen mounted Spaniards to defeat Indian armies numbering in the thousands. Everyone who's born in the Western Hemisphere is a Native American. We are all Native Americans. If aliens visit us, the outcome would be much as when Columbus landed in America, which didn't turn out well for the Native Americans. Native Americans are the original inhabitants of the land that now constitutes the United States. They have helped develop the fundamental principles of freedom of speech and separation of powers that form the foundation of the United States government. It's striking that Native Americans evolved no devastating epidemic diseases to give to Europeans, in return for the many devastating epidemic diseases that Indians received from the Old World. America is made up of people who came from someplace else. Even the Native Americans came over the Bering Strait. America is what it is because people came from someplace else. In New Mexico, we're very lucky that we have laws in place that really help ensure that Native Americans' right to vote is unencumbered. All Americans are either immigrants or descendants of ancestors who came from somewhere else, including Native Americans. We should all respect and admire immigrants. Every president since Nixon has embraced a policy of self-determination without termination, the idea that Native Americans are best equipped to govern themselves. Trump is breaking with this position. I represent more Native Americans than anyone else in Congress. In the end, there is no absence of irony. The integrity of what is sacred to Native Americans will be determined by the government that has been responsible for doing everything in its power to destroy Native American cultures. It almost seems that nobody can hate America as much as Native Americans. America needs new immigrants to love and cherish it. One of the first things people think of when they think of Native Americans is reservations. We didn't have any idea what that was. We were just young kids growing up in normal blue-collar America. What we are doing in the United States is we have launched a television station for mainstream audiences, which means whether they are Native Americans or people living from any part of the world. I always see America as really belonging to the Native Americans. Even though I'm American, I still feel like a visitor in my own country. If anyone can say, "Go back," it's Native Americans. My Pueblo ancestors, despite being targeted at every juncture, despite facing famine and drought, still inhabit this country today. But indigenous people aren't asking anyone to go back to where they came from. As a Cherokee, I can attest to the fact that Native Americans have been on the losing side of history. Our rights have been infringed upon, our treaties have been broken, our culture has been stolen, and our tribes have been decimated at the hands of our own United States government. President Obama should pardon Leonard Peltier, or at least commute his sentence, not just for humanitarian reasons, but also as a way of acknowledging the injustice suffered by Native Americans. While they trace their history back to wars that helped to ethnically cleanse Native Americans and to their exploits in the Civil War fighting for the South, the modern-day Rangers were created to help rejuvenate a defeated and demoralized U.S. imperialism after the war in Vietnam. In Texas, the Rangers were established on an ad hoc basis in the 1820s to protect the settlers making inroads into Spanish borderlands. Soon, Mexicans and Mexican Americans replaced Native Americans as the prime target of Ranger repression. I have 4 relatively small children, and around 4th grade, they start doing big projects on Native Americas. Everything is Native Americans in elementary school. Do you know how many Native American dresses I've sewn? On and on. It's a full year-long study. And then never again. As journalists, we never even cover Native Americans. I have a philosophy that white people would be interested in Native Americans because, first of all, it's probably the only group as a country we all study and know the history and then never study again past the age of 10. So I think we have these things we believe are true, that are just not true about what an audience wants. The contributions of African Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants throughout our nation's history are undeniable, but the tendency to overlook their gallant efforts is pervasive and persistent. When I was a kid, I really loved Indians. Native Americans, pardon me. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.